The sleepy town of Red Creek lay nestled along Route 66, its quiet streets lined with cozy diners and small shops. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where locals greeted each other by name, and trouble rarely lingered for long. But as the golden rays of the evening sun stretched across the asphalt, the town was about to witness a confrontation that would go down in history. Marcus Grayson, a seasoned truck driver, pulled his massive blue semi into its usual spot outside the Red Creek diner. At 52, Marcus was a bear of a man with a thick beard peppered with gray and a pair of sharp, calculating eyes. His plaid shirt and worn jeans gave the impression of a simple man, but his posture, straight-backed and deliberate, hinted at a deeper story. Unbeknownst to the locals, Marcus was a retired Special Forces captain, a man who had seen and survived battles most couldn't imagine. Inside the diner, Emma Ward, the owner, was wiping down the counter. She was a kind-hearted woman in her 40s, known for her warm smile and meatloaf that locals swore was the best in the state. She watched Marcus through the window as he parked, her expression softening. For years, Marcus had been her Tuesday regular, ordering the same meal of meatloaf and extra mashed potatoes. What she didn't know was that Marcus chose her diner for more than the food. It offered a clear view of the highway and a strategic advantage in case of trouble, habits he hadn't shaken from his military days. As the evening settled in, the sound of roaring motorcycles shattered the tranquility. 3 bikes pulled into the parking lot, their engines growling like predators marking their territory. The riders dismounted, their leather jackets adorned with the snarling wolf insignia of the Steel Fangs motorcycle club. Leading the pack was Flint, a tall man with piercing eyes and a smug grin. Behind him were Cutter, wiry and covered in tattoos, and Tank, a massive figure whose mere presence seemed to make the ground quake. The trio swaggered into the diner, their boots thudding against the floor. Flint's gaze swept the room, landing on Emma. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Real cozy." Emma stepped out from behind the counter, her hands gripping a rag as her eyes darted to the baseball bat hidden beneath the register. "What can I get you boys?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Cutter leaned on the counter, smirking. "How about everything in the register, for starters?" The handful of customers tensed, the air thick with unease. A father in the corner moved to shield his young daughter, while old Doc Harris, a retired medic, lowered his newspaper, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Flint chuckled, placing a hand on Cutter's shoulder. "Easy, Cutter. We're just here to talk business." He turned to Emma, his tone taking on a menacing edge. "See, this stretch of highway is under new management. We're here to discuss your monthly protection fees." From his seat, Marcus continued eating, his movements calm but deliberate. His instincts, honed through years of combat, told him this wasn't going to end peacefully. Flint's demeanor, the way he scanned the room and the deliberate positioning of his men, reminded Marcus of the petty warlords he had dealt with overseas. "This is a family diner," Emma replied, her voice steady. "We don't need protection." Flint's smile faded, his tone darkening. "Everyone needs protection, sweetheart. Equipment breaks down, supplies go missing, accidents happen." Tank wandered over to the father's table, deliberately bumping the little girl's chair. She whimpered, clutching her mother's arm. That was when Marcus spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The lady said she's not interested." The diner fell silent as all eyes turned to Marcus. Flint's grin returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. Well, well, looks like we've got ourselves a hero." Marcus set down his fork and looked up, his calm gaze locking onto Flint's. "You're making it my business." Flint leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. "And just who do you think you are?" "Just a guy trying to enjoy his coffee," Marcus replied evenly. "But I know who you are. Steel Fangs, moving up from Texas. Same pattern every time. Start with intimidation, move on to smuggling and drugs. I've seen it before." Flint's eyes narrowed. "You seem to know a lot about us." Marcus leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "I know enough to tell you you're making a mistake." The tension in the room was palpable as Cutter's hand drifted toward his belt. Marcus didn't flinch. "You've got 2 choices," he said, his tone firm. "Walk out that door and find somewhere else to cause trouble, or try whatever you're thinking and see how it works out." For a moment, no one moved. Then Flint chuckled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Come on, boys," he said, jerking his head toward the door. "We'll finish this later." As the bikers roared away, Flint pointed 2 fingers at his eyes and then at the diner, a silent warning. Once the sound of motorcycles faded, the tension in the diner broke. The father approached Marcus, his voice shaky. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if—" Marcus cut him off gently. "Nothing was going to happen to your family. Not here." He turned to Emma. "You might want to call the sheriff, let him know the Steel Fangs are moving into town." Emma nodded, already reaching for the phone. "They'll be back, won't they?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said, returning to his meal. "And next time, they'll bring more." The next morning, the first rays of sunlight illuminated Red Creek's main street, but the unease of the previous night lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Marcus sat at the diner counter nursing a cup of coffee, his mind working through the situation with military precision. The Steel Fangs weren't just a gang looking for easy pickings. They were organized, ruthless, and clearly looking to establish a foothold. He knew their kind too well. They wouldn't stop until they either controlled the town or were forced out completely. By mid-morning, Marcus was already making moves. His phone buzzed repeatedly as he called old friends. Veterans from his unit, truckers he'd worked with over the years, people who knew how to handle trouble. One by one, they agreed to help. Some were retired soldiers, others truck drivers who shared Marcus's sense of justice. All of them understood the stakes. The first to arrive was Big Steve Carter, a former Army Ranger with hands like anvils and a booming laugh that could make even the sternest drill sergeant smile. Big Steve pulled up in his rig, a hulking figure that dwarfed even Marcus. "Heard you've got a biker problem," he said with a grin, clapping Marcus on the back. "Thought I'd stop by and lend a hand." Next came Doc Harris, the retired medic who'd been in the diner the night before. He showed up with a duffel bag of medical supplies and a grim determination in his eyes. "Figured I'd stick around," he said, "just in case things get messy." By noon, half a dozen more had arrived, each bringing their own skill and stories. There was Elena, a wiry woman with a sharp wit and a sharper aim, and Ray, a quiet man whose unassuming demeanor hid a talent for strategy. They gathered in the diner, a motley crew of veterans and truckers, but as they strategized, Sheriff Tucker arrived, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. The sheriff was a stocky man in his 50s with a weathered face that had seen its fair share of trouble. He leaned against the counter watching the group. "You really think this is necessary?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "They're coming back, Sheriff, and they're not going to play nice. We need to be ready." The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I've got 3 deputies, Marcus. If they roll in with a dozen bikers, we're outgunned." "You won't have to do this alone," Marcus said firmly. "We're not just truckers. We've been through worse." The sheriff studied the group, then nodded. "All right, but let's make sure this doesn't turn into a war." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Marcus and his crew set up a network of security measures around the town. Cameras were installed on key roads, offering clear views of anyone entering or leaving. Locals were quietly warned to stay vigilant, and the community began to rally. Word spread quickly that trouble was brewing. But instead of fear, it sparked a sense of unity. Shop owners kept an eye out for suspicious activity, and neighbors checked in on each other. By sunset, Red Creek was no longer just a quiet town. It was a town on alert. When the roar of motorcycles broke the evening calm, Marcus and his team were ready. This time, it wasn't just 3 bikes. A dozen Steel Fangs roared into the parking lot, their engines snarling like wolves on the hunt. Flint was at the front, his cold eyes scanning the diner as he dismounted. Behind him, his men spread out, their presence a deliberate show of force. Inside, Marcus stood at the counter, his expression calm. Big Steve was by the window, his massive arms crossed, while Elena and Ray sat at a corner booth, their sharp eyes tracking every movement outside. Doc Harris stood near the door, his posture relaxed but ready. Sheriff Tucker was behind the counter, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Flint stepped inside, his boots echoing against the tile floor. He glanced around, his smirk faltering as he took in the scene. This wasn't what he'd expected. The diner wasn't filled with scared civilians, it was filled with people who looked like they were waiting for a fight. "Well," Flint said, his voice loud and mocking, "looks like you've got yourself a little army." Marcus stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't your territory. Turn around and leave." Flint chuckled, though it sounded forced. "And who's going to stop us? You?" He gestured to his men. "We've got the numbers." "You don't have what it takes," Marcus replied evenly. Flint's grin faded. "You're making a mistake." No," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "You are." For a moment, the tension was suffocating. Cutter's hand drifted toward his belt again, and Tank cracked his knuckles. But Marcus's team didn't flinch. Big Steve took a deliberate step forward, his sheer size enough to make the nearest biker take a step back. Elena's hand rested casually on her jacket, where a small but visible bulge hinted at what she was hiding. Flint hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of the stares around him. These weren't frightened townsfolk. They were people who had seen worse and weren't afraid to stand their ground. Finally, Flint jerked his head toward the door. "Let's go," he growled, though his tone lacked conviction. As the Steel Fangs retreated to their bikes, Flint paused at the door, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "This isn't over." Marcus watched them ride off, his expression unreadable. He knew Flint wasn't bluffing. This was only the beginning. As the night settled over Red Creek, the diner buzzed with quiet conversation. The townspeople began to trickle in, thanking Marcus and his team, offering food and supplies, but Marcus's focus was elsewhere. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, his mind already working through the next steps. Red Creek wasn't just a town anymore. It was a battlefield, and Marcus knew the fight was far from over. As the night deepened, Red Creek settled into an uneasy quiet, though the tension in the air lingered. Marcus leaned against the diner's counter, his gaze distant, scanning the windows as if expecting headlights to flash through the darkness at any moment. Despite the apparent calm, his mind raced. He wasn't just thinking about the Steel Fangs and their next move, he was strategizing for contingencies. In his years as a captain, he had learned to plan for the unexpected, and tonight was no exception. Doc Harris joined him at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. "You've got that look again," Doc said, his voice low. "The one you used to get before a mission. What's on your mind?" Marcus rubbed his jaw, his beard scratching under his palm. "Flint's testing us," he said. "He'll come back, but not in the way we expect. If he's smart, and I think he is, he'll aim for a different kind of disruption." Doc tilted his head. "Like what?" "Divide and conquer," Marcus replied. "He'll try to fracture the town, make people doubt each other. Fear is their weapon as much as brute force." As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from one of the truckers in his network. He glanced at it and frowned. "They've already started." "What do you mean?" Doc asked, his tone sharpening. "They've set up a roadblock just outside of town," Marcus said, showing Doc the text. "Stopped one of our guys, tried to shake him down. They're testing our response." Doc cursed under his breath. "And if we don't respond?" "They'll escalate," Marcus said simply. "We need to act, but carefully." Mark called a quick meeting with the group. Big Steve, Elena, Ray, and Sheriff Tucker gathered around the diner's largest booth, their expressions grim as Marcus laid out the situation. "We can't let them control the roads," Marcus began. "That's their lifeline. Smuggling, intimidation, movement. If they think they can block access to this town, they'll tighten the noose. But if we go out there guns blazing, we risk starting a war," Tucker interjected. "I've got the state police on speed dial, but we need evidence if we're going to get them involved." "Then we get evidence," Elena said, her tone sharp. "Surveillance drones, hidden cameras, whatever we need to catch them in the act." Big Steve leaned back, his massive arms crossed. "I can take a couple of guys and clear the roadblock tonight." Quietly. Marcus shook his head. "We don't want to spook them just yet. Let's use this as an opportunity to gather intel. Ray, you're good with tech. Can you rig something up?" Ray nodded, his quiet demeanor masking the gears turning in his mind. "I've got a drone in my truck. I can set it up to watch the roadblock without them noticing." "Good," Marcus said. "Once we've got footage, we'll decide our next move." The team dispersed, each person taking on their assigned task. Ray headed out to deploy the drone, while Big Steve and Elena kept watch from a distance. Sheriff Tucker, reluctant but cooperative, agreed to start drafting a formal report to escalate the situation if needed. Meanwhile, Marcus remained at the diner, coordinating and preparing for what he knew would be a long night. As the hours dragged on, the drone fed back live footage of the roadblock. Marcus watched on a laptop as the Steel Fangs harassed passing vehicles, forcing some to stop while others sped away in fear. Flint was there, barking orders, his movements controlled and deliberate. It was clear he wasn't just some thug, he was a man with a plan. "They're setting up for something bigger," Marcus muttered to himself. Around 3 a.m., a call came through on Marcus's phone. It was one of the truckers from his network, a young guy named Danny who had been hauling a late-night load through the area. "They stopped me," Danny said, his voice trembling. "Tried to take my cargo. I managed to get away, but they shot at my truck, Marcus. They're not messing around." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Are you safe now?" "Yeah, I'm at the gas station a few miles out, but they're still there." Marcus hung up and relayed the information to the group. Sheriff Tucker stood, his face pale. "Shooting at vehicles, that's not just intimidation, that's attempted murder." This just became a whole different ballgame. "We need to shut them down," Marcus said, his voice cold. "Now." Tucker nodded. "I'll get the state police involved. This is enough to pull them in." As Tucker stepped outside to make the call, Marcus turned to the rest of the group. "We're not waiting for backup. If they're armed, they're a threat to everyone on that road." Big Steve grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Finally, some action!" Marcus, Big Steve, Elena, and Doc geared up and headed out, their vehicles moving silently through the dark streets. They stopped a safe distance from the roadblock, parking behind a cluster of trees. Ray's drone provided a live feed, showing the Steel Fangs gathered around a fire they had lit in a metal barrel, their laughter echoing into the night. Marcus surveyed the scene, his mind working quickly. "Elena, you and Ray flank them on the left. Steve, you're with me on the right. Doc, stay back and keep an eye on the situation. If things go sideways, we'll need you." The group moved into position, their years of training evident in their silent, coordinated movements. Marcus signaled for Elena and Ray to move first. They crept closer, setting up hidden cameras to capture every angle of the Steel Fangs operation. When the time was right, Marcus stepped forward, his imposing figure emerging from the shadows. Flint's head snapped up, his smug grin returning as he recognized Marcus. "Well, look who it is," Flint said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The hero from the diner. Come to join the party?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his cold stare unnerving the bikers. "You're done here," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Pack up and leave while you still can." Flint laughed, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his tone. "And if we don't?" Marcus took a step closer, his presence commanding. "You've already crossed the line. Shooting at vehicles, that's enough to put you away for a long time. The cops are on their way and we've got everything on tape." Flint's grin faltered. He looked around at his men, some of whom were shifting uncomfortably. "You think you're scaring us?" he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't need to scare you," Marcus replied. "I just need you to know that this ends now." At that moment, Big Steve and Elena stepped out of the shadows, their imposing figures flanking Marcus. Ray's drone hovered above, its camera light blinking ominously. The bikers froze, realizing they were surrounded. Flint hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. He glanced at Marcus, then at the drone, and finally at his men. "Let's go," he growled, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't over." As the Steel Fangs mounted their bikes and roared away, Marcus exhaled slowly. The road was clear, but he knew this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Red Creek, but the tension of the previous night still clung to the town like a storm cloud. The Steel Fangs had retreated for now, but Marcus knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Flint wasn't the kind of man to back down, not when his reputation was on the line. Inside the diner, the air was heavy with conversation. Locals had started to trickle in, drawn by rumors of the roadblock confrontation. Marcus sat at his usual spot, nursing a cup of coffee while Sheriff Tucker paced nearby, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with the state police. "You sure they're gone for now?" Emma asked, as she placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter. Marcus nodded but didn't take his eyes off the window. "For now. But Flint will regroup. He's too stubborn to let this go." Emma glanced toward the parking lot, where a few familiar trucks were parked. "What do we do if they come back?" "We won't give them the chance to catch us off guard," Marcus said firmly. "They're going to try something new, something bigger. We need to be ready." By mid-morning, the state police arrived in full force. 2 unmarked SUVs and a squad car pulled into the diner parking lot, their presence drawing curious stares from passers-by. Lieutenant Hannah Delgado, a no-nonsense officer with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped out of the lead vehicle. She had a reputation for taking down organized crime groups, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen it all. "Marcus Grayson," she said, extending a hand as she approached him. "Heard a lot about you this morning." Marcus shook her hand. "Wish it were under better circumstances." Delgado nodded, her expression serious. "We've been tracking the Steel Fangs for months, but they've managed to stay one step ahead. What happened here gives us leverage. Your footage and reports will go a long way." "They're not done," Marcus warned. "Flint isn't just going to run. He'll dig in deeper, find new ways to get what he wants." Delgado frowned, her mind already working through the implications. "Then we need to cut them off before they can regroup." While Delgado and her team began reviewing the evidence, Marcus and his crew reconvened at the diner to discuss the next steps. The veterans had shifted from casual camaraderie to a focused, mission-oriented mindset. Maps and notes were spread across one of the tables, and Ray had set up a laptop displaying live drone feeds of the surrounding area. "They're not just after control of this town," Marcus said, tapping a finger on the map. "They want the entire route. Red Creek is just a stepping stone. If they can establish control here, they'll expand their operation up and down Route 66. Big Steve leaned over the map, his brows furrowed. "So, what's their next move?" "Ballistics," Marcus replied. "They'll try to cut off our supply lines, truck routes, fuel stations, anything they can use to choke the town." Elena folded her arms. "Then we hit them first. Take out their resources before they can use them against us." "That's risky," Doc Harris said. "If we escalate, they might respond with something worse." Marcus nodded. "That's why we need to be smart about this. Delgado's team can handle the legal side, but we need to keep the town secure in the meantime." As the group strategized, Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from Danny, the young trucker who had been targeted the night before. Danny's voice was urgent. "Marcus, I think they're following me." "Where are you?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. "About 5 miles out, near the old grain silo," Danny said. "I saw a couple of bikes in my mirror. They've been tailing me since I left the station." Marcus motioned to Ray, who quickly pulled up the drone feed for the area. Sure enough, 2 motorcycles were visible in the distance, trailing Danny's truck. "Keep driving," Marcus told Danny. "Don't stop for anything. We'll intercept them." Big Steve and Elena were already on their feet, grabbing their gear as Marcus relayed the situation. Within minutes, they were in Marcus's truck, heading toward Danny's location. Sheriff Tucker followed in his patrol car, his lights off to avoid drawing attention. The grain silo came into view just as Danny's truck turned onto a narrow back road. The motorcycles closed the distance, one of the riders pulling up alongside the cab and gesturing for Danny to stop. Danny, to his credit, stayed calm and kept driving. Marcus's truck roared up behind them, its horn blaring. The bikers turned, their surprise evident as Marcus's rig loomed closer. One of them swerved, losing control and skidding into a ditch. The other gunned his engine, trying to escape, but Sheriff Tucker's patrol car cut him off. The biker threw his hands up as Tucker stepped out of his car, weapon drawn. Marcus parked his truck and climbed down, his imposing figure making the captured biker shrink back. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and threatening. The biker hesitated, but a sharp glare from Tucker made him reconsider. "Flint," he admitted. "He wanted us to scare the kid, maybe rough him up." "Where is he?" Tucker asked. The biker shook his head. "I don't know. He moves around. Keeps us guessing." Marcus exchanged a look with Tucker. This was just another move in Flint's game, and it wouldn't be the last. Back at the diner, Delgado was waiting for them, her expression grim. "We've got a lead," she said, gesturing to her laptop. "One of Flint's suppliers flipped. He gave us the location of a warehouse they've been using as a staging ground." Marcus leaned over the screen, studying the map. The warehouse was located about 20 miles outside of town, in a remote area surrounded by dense woods. It was the perfect place for the Steel Fangs to store weapons, drugs, and other contraband. "They'll be armed," Delgado warned. "This won't be a simple raid." Marcus nodded. "Then we'd better be ready." The plan came together quickly. Delgado's team would lead the raid, with Marcus and his crew providing backup. The veterans geared up with an efficiency born of experience, checking weapons and equipment with practiced hands. Sheriff Tucker, despite his initial reluctance, joined the effort, his resolve solidified by the events of the past few days. As night fell, the convoy headed toward the warehouse. The woods were dark and silent, the kind of silence that heightened every sound, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant hoot of an owl. Marcus felt the familiar adrenaline coursing through him, sharpening his senses. When they reached the perimeter, Delgado signaled for the team to split up. Marcus and Big Steve moved toward the rear entrance, while Elena and Ray took the side. Delgado and her officers approached the front, their weapons at the ready. The first sign of trouble came when a guard stepped out for a smoke, his flashlight sweeping the area. Marcus froze, signaling for Steve to stay low. The guard turned, his gaze passing over their hiding spot before he went back inside. Marcus tapped his earpiece. "Guard at the back door, be ready." Delgado's voice crackled in response. "Copy that. On your signal." Marcus waited for the perfect moment, then moved swiftly, his hand closing over the guard's mouth as he pulled him into the shadows. The man struggled briefly before going limp. Marcus lowered him to the ground, signaling for Steve to move. The raid unfolded with military precision. Delgado's team breached the front entrance, their shoutouts echoing through the warehouse. The Steel Fangs scrambled, some reaching for weapons, others trying to escape. Marcus and his team swept through the building, cutting off exits and subduing resistance. By the time the dust settled, the warehouse was secure. Flint was nowhere to be found, but the evidence left behind was enough to cripple the Steel Fangs operation. Weapons, drugs, and ledgers detailing their activities were all confiscated. As Delgado's team secured the site, Marcus stepped outside, his gaze scanning the horizon. Flint had escaped again, but his power was waning. Red Creek had stood its ground, and the Steel Fangs' days were numbered. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and for the first time in days, the town of Red Creek felt a little safer. The warehouse raid marked a turning point for Red Creek, but Marcus knew better than to consider the fight won. Flint might have been driven out of his base of operations, but he was still out there, regrouping, planning, and likely more desperate than ever. A cornered enemy, Marcus reminded himself, was the most dangerous kind. In the days following the raid, Red Creek's residents found a cautious sense of relief. The evidence seized from the warehouse had sparked a multi-state investigation, and the state police promised additional patrols along Route 66 to deter further trouble. But Marcus wasn't satisfied. The Steel Fangs weren't just a nuisance, they were a threat, and threats didn't disappear just because of one setback. He spent his mornings at the diner, sipping coffee and poring over maps of the surrounding areas, searching for patterns in the Steel Fangs' movements. Sheriff Tucker stopped by regularly, offering updates on the investigation and sharing intel from Delgado's team. The two men had developed a grudging respect for each other, born out of the mutual understanding that they were fighting a battle with no room for ego. One afternoon, as Marcus traced potential escape routes on his map, Emma approached with a tray of sandwiches. She set them down on the table and crossed her arms, her expression equal parts concern and determination. "You haven't been sleeping much," she said. Marcus glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Plenty of time for that later." Emma pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Marcus, you've done more for this town than anyone could have asked. But this isn't just your fight. You can't carry it all on your shoulders." Marcus leaned back, studying her for a moment. "It's not just about the town. This is about making sure people like Flint don't get to think they can walk into a place like Red Creek and take whatever they want. It's about sending a message." Emma nodded slowly. "Then let us help." The people here, they're stronger than you think. We've been watching you, learning from you. If Flint comes back, we'll be ready." Her words gave Marcus pause. He had always operated with the mindset of a soldier, taking responsibility for every decision, every risk. But Emma was right. This wasn't a battlefield overseas. This was a community, and communities fought together. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally. Later that evening, Marcus called another meeting at the diner. His crew, Big Steve, Elena, Ray, and Doc Harris, gathered around the same booth they'd been using for weeks. Sheriff Tucker joined them, along with a handful of local business owners and truckers who had volunteered to help. "We've made progress," Marcus began, gesturing to a map pinned to the wall. "The raid on the warehouse cut off their supply chain, but it didn't eliminate the threat. Flint's still out there, and he's not going to let this go." "What's his next move?" Tucker asked. Marcus tapped the map. "If I were him, I'd be looking for leverage, something to force us to back down." "Like what?" Big Steve asked. "Could be anything," Marcus said. "Kidnapping, sabotage, spreading fear. We need to think like him, anticipate his next move." Elena leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the map. "There's another angle we haven't considered. Flint isn't working alone. He's got connections, suppliers, other gangs, maybe even corrupt officials. If we can disrupt those relationships, we can cut him off at the knees." Ray nodded. "I've been analyzing the ledgers we pulled from the warehouse. There are names, transactions, routes. It's a network, and if we hit it hard enough, we can collapse it." Marcus listened carefully, his mind already piecing together a plan. "Good, start digging. Find out who's backing Flint and where they're vulnerable. In the meantime, we'll focus on securing the town." As the meeting broke up, Marcus lingered at the counter, his thoughts turning to Flint. The man was a puzzle, a mix of raw intimidation and calculated strategy. Marcus had faced men like him before, but there was something about Flint that gnawed at him, a feeling that this fight was more personal than it seemed. The answer came a few nights later, in the form of an unexpected visitor. It was late, the diner nearly empty, when a young woman walked in. She was in her early 20s, with a lean frame and a wary look in her eyes. Her clothes were dusty, as if she'd been on the road for days, and she carried a battered backpack slung over one shoulder. "Marcus Grayson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus set down his coffee and turned to face her. "That's me." The woman glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "My name's Carly. I need your help." Marcus studied her, his instincts immediately on high alert. "What's this about?" "It's Flint," she said, her voice trembling. "He's my brother." The room fell silent. Even Sheriff Tucker, who had been sitting a few stools away, stopped mid-sip and stared. "I didn't come here to defend him," Carly added quickly. "I came because I know what he's planning, and if you don't stop him, people are going to get hurt." Marcus motioned for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Start from the beginning." Carly hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack. "Flint wasn't always like this," she said. "He used to be a decent guy. But after our parents died, he got involved with the wrong people. They fed into his anger, his need for control. Now, he's too far gone." "And what's he planning?" Marcus asked. "He's desperate," Carly said. "The raid on the warehouse cost him everything. His men are starting to doubt him, and he thinks taking this town is the only way to prove he's still in charge. He's pulling together anyone who's still loyal, plus a few favors from other gangs." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "How many?" "Enough to make it a fight," Carly said. "They're planning to hit the town square tomorrow night. Flint thinks if he can take out you and the sheriff, the rest of the town will fall in line." Marcus exchanged a glance with Tucker, who immediately reached for his phone to alert Delgado. Carly's information changed everything. The Steel Fangs weren't regrouping. They were planning an all-out assault. "We'll be ready," Marcus said. The next 24 hours were a blur of preparation. Marcus and his crew worked tirelessly, coordinating with Delgado's team and rallying the townspeople. Barricades were set up along the main roads, and volunteers took shifts, watching for any sign of the Steel Fangs. The veterans trained locals on basic self-defense, ensuring that everyone knew how to stay safe if the worst happened. As night fell, Red Creek braced for the attack. Marcus stood in the center of town, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for movement. Big Steve was stationed at the north barricade, while Elena and Ray manned the east. Sheriff Tucker and Delgado's officers were spread out, radios crackling with updates. Then, in the distance, the roar of motorcycles shattered the silence. The Steel Fangs arrived in force, their headlights cutting through the night as they rolled into town. Flint was at the front, his expression hard and unyielding. Behind him were a mix of familiar faces and new recruits, all spoiling for a fight. But Red Creek was ready. The first wave of bikers hit the barricades and were met with resistance. Tires screeched as the Steel Fangs tried to navigate the obstacles, only to find themselves flanked by Delgado's officers. Big Steve and his team intercepted another group, their sheer presence enough to send some of the less committed bikers fleeing. Flint, however, pressed on. He dismounted his bike in the town square, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "This ends tonight," he growled. "You're right about that," Marcus replied, stepping forward. The two men faced off, the town square their battleground. Flint swung first, his punch wild but powerful. Marcus dodged easily, his years of training turning the fight into a calculated dance. Every move Flint made, Marcus countered, his calm precision wearing the biker down. Around them, the chaos began to subside as Delgado's team rounded up the remaining bikers. The townspeople cheered as one by one, the Steel Fangs were taken into custody. Finally, Flint collapsed to his knees, his energy spent. Marcus stood over him, his breathing steady. "It's over," he said. Flint looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and defeat. "You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," Marcus said. "For this town, and for you." As Flint was led away in handcuffs, the residents of Red Creek began to gather, their cheers echoing through the night. The battle was won. But more importantly, the town had proved its resilience. Red Creek wasn't just a sleepy stop on Route 66 anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when people stood together against fear. For Marcus, it was a reminder of why he had come to this town in the first place. And as he stood among the cheering crowd, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The fight might not be over, but tonight, Red Creek was safe. Loved this story? Click the next video for more, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss our latest uploads.